My name is Fiona Yerger, and at 32 years old, I had already spent most of my life taking care of other people. I worked as a pediatric ICU nurse in Dayton, Ohio, spending 12-hour overnight shifts watching over critically ill children while somehow still finding the energy to raise my 80-year-old daughter Lily on my own. People always described me the same way. Dependable, reliable, the one who could handle everything. My parents said it constantly. My older sister Karen depended on it. And even at the hospital, everyone knew that if a shift needed covering or a crisis needed calming down, I would be the one to step forward. 2 years earlier, I had moved back to Dayton because my mother's heart problems had started getting worse, and my father's knee surgery left him struggling to walk. Karen kept calling me saying, "You're the nurse, Fiona. You know what to do." So I left behind the small but peaceful life Lily and I had built in Columbus and came home believing family was supposed to help each other. From the moment I returned, I became everyone's unpaid caretaker. I drove my mother to dozens of cardiology appointments, handled complicated VA paperwork for my father, fixed insurance issues, helped Karen with taxes, babysat during emergencies, and solved every family problem nobody else wanted to deal with. I never complained because helping people had become second nature to me. It was how I survived life. After Lily's father walked away when she was only 2 years old, I learned that if I stayed useful enough, dependable enough, needed enough, maybe nobody would leave again. But while I spent years taking care of everyone else, nobody noticed how exhausted I was becoming. My daughter Lily quietly learned not to ask for much because she already understood that her mother carried the entire world alone. She packed her own lunches, left sweet notes on the refrigerator reminding me to eat after long hospital shifts, and waited patiently through the chaos of our lives without ever making things harder for me. What hurt the most was seeing how differently my mother treated Lily compared to my niece Mackenzie, Karen's 16-year-old daughter. My mother adored Mackenzie openly and proudly, driving hours to volleyball games, taking her shopping, posting endless photos online, and bragging about every little achievement like she had personally raised her. Meanwhile, Lily's piano recitals went unnoticed, birthdays felt rushed, and invitations were forgotten unless I reminded everyone myself. I tried convincing myself it did not matter because Lily had me, but deep down I knew children notice when they are treated like an afterthought. Still, I kept showing up for my family because I believed eventually loyalty would be returned when it mattered most. Then came the night everything changed. I was halfway through a brutal overnight shift at the pediatric ICU when a stabbing pain exploded through my lower abdomen. At first I ignored it, thinking it was stress or exhaustion, but within hours the pain became unbearable. My coworker Becca found me bent over at the nurse's station, barely able to breathe, and rushed me downstairs to the emergency room. The doctors moved quickly. CT, scan, blood work, surgical consult. A female doctor named Singh looked me directly in the eyes and told me my appendix was close to fully rupturing and I needed emergency surgery immediately before infection spread through my body. I understood exactly what that meant because I had cared for patients with sepsis before. I knew how fast things could turn deadly, but none of that terrified me as much as one single thought. Lily was home asleep alone. My regular babysitter was elderly and unable to drive at night, and I had no backup plan because I had spent years believing my parents would always be there in a real emergency. Lying in that hospital bed shaking from pain and fear, I grabbed my phone and called my mother at 2 in the morning. My hands were trembling so badly I nearly dropped the phone while it rang. When she finally answered, sounding annoyed and half asleep, I immediately explained everything. I told her I was in the ER, that my appendix was rupturing, and that I needed her to go stay with Lily before I was taken into surgery. There was a long silence on the line before she finally responded, not with panic or concern, but irritation. She sighed heavily and reminded me that she and Mackenzie had been planning for a huge concert that weekend for over a year, and she needed her sleep because they were leaving early in the morning to prepare. For a moment, I genuinely thought she misunderstood the situation. I remember staring at the hospital ceiling while machines beeped around me, trying to process the fact that my own mother sounded more inconvenienced than worried. While I was preparing for emergency surgery, I asked again, this time nearly begging, explaining that Lily would wake up alone and terrified if nobody came. My mother hesitated before finally agreeing in the coldest possible way, making It sounded like I had forced her into some unbearable burden. Instead of asking for help during a medical emergency, the call ended, and I sat there in stunned silence, realizing something inside me had shifted forever. For years, I had sacrificed sleep, money, time, relationships, and my own health for my family, because I believed that was what love looked like. But lying there in that ER bed facing surgery alone, while worrying more about my daughter than myself, I realized the truth was devastatingly simple. I had spent years being available for people who would never truly be there for me when it mattered most. The moment my mother told me she needed her sleep more than I needed help, something inside me went completely numb. I lay there in the emergency room staring at the bright fluorescent lights while waves of pain rolled through my stomach so violently I could barely breathe. The doctors had already explained that my appendix was close to rupturing completely and that every minute mattered. But all I could think about was my daughter asleep alone at home. Lily was only 8 years old. She still slept with a moon-shaped nightlight plugged into the wall beside her bed because complete darkness scared her every night. Before leaving for my hospital shifts, I tucked her and kissed her forehead and promised I would always come home before breakfast. But now I was lying in a hospital bed about to be wheeled into emergency surgery with nobody willing to go sit beside her while she slept. When my mother answered the phone, I expected panic, concern, urgency. Something maternal. Instead, her voice sounded irritated, like I had woken her over something trivial. I explained through shaking breaths that my appendix was rupturing, that I needed surgery immediately, and that Lily was home alone. There was a long pause before she sighed and reminded me about the Taylor Swift concert she had been planning for over a year with my niece Mackenzie. She said she needed rest because the drive to the venue was 3 hours long, and she did not want to be exhausted. For a second, I genuinely thought I had misheard her. I remember gripping the edge of the hospital mattress so tightly my fingers hurt while monitors beeped around me and nurses moved through the hallway outside the curtain. I repeated myself more clearly this time, telling her Lily was alone and that I had nobody else to call. My mother responded by casually saying Lily usually slept through the night anyway. Then I heard my father's voice in the background, asking what was happening. My mother muffled the phone for a moment, but I still heard enough to understand. She wants us to come right now, she whispered. For what, her stomach or something? My father asked, annoyed and half asleep. A few seconds later, he took the phone himself. Instead of concern, his voice carried the same cold impatience. He asked why I could not simply wake up a neighbor or call someone from work. He reminded me my mother had spent 14 months looking forward to this concert and implied I was being dramatic for interrupting those plans over what he called a stomach issue. I sat there stunned while pain burned through my abdomen, because in that moment I realized my emergency had become an inconvenience to them instead of a crisis. Then my mother took the phone back and said something I will probably remember for the rest of my life. She told me, you always figure things out, Fiona, you always do. It was not encouragement. It was dismissal. It was her way of saying she had already decided not to help because she believed I would somehow solve the problem without her. The line went silent afterward, and I understood. She was waiting for me to stop asking, so I swallowed the lump in my throat and quietly said, okay, Mom. Then I hung up. I placed my phone face down on the hospital bed and stared at the ceiling, because if I looked at anyone in that room, I knew I would break apart completely. A nurse standing near the doorway gently asked if I was all right, and out of habit, I answered yes. I had spent my entire life saying yes for other people. Yes, I could drive Mom to another appointment. Yes, I could spend hours fixing Dad's paperwork. Yes, I could help Karen with her taxes again. Yes, I could babysit, organize, carry, fix, schedule, and sacrifice. Saying yes had become automatic even when my entire body was screaming no. My coworker Becca had heard enough of the conversation to understand exactly what had happened. She leaned against the wall with her arms crossed and simply said, they're not coming, are they? I shook my head and explained through tears I was trying desperately not to shed that my parents were choosing a concert over helping me during emergency surgery. Becca stared at me in disbelief for several seconds before immediately pulling out her phone. Unlike my family, she did not waste time making excuses. She called her cousin Marisol, who ran an overnight emergency care service, and within minutes, she had arranged for a nurse named Andrea to go stay with Lily until morning while my parents worried about friendship bracelets and concert seats. My exhausted coworker spent the middle of her overnight shift solving a crisis. She had no obligation to fix. Andrea arrived at my house before 3 in the morning, and Becca reassured me that Lily would probably think it was some kind of surprise sleepover. I remember giving Becca my debit card information from memory, while tears slid silently down the sides of my face into the hospital pillow. The overnight care cost nearly $300 money I really could not spare, but at least my daughter would not wake up alone, and terrified. A little later, the anesthesiologist arrived with consent forms while surgical nurses attached identification bracelets around my wrist. When I glanced down at the emergency contact section, I noticed something that nearly shattered me emotionally. The listed contact was not my mother or father. It was Lily. My 80-year-old daughter was the only person in my family who had never once made me feel like I needed to earn love through usefulness. As the nurses wheeled me toward the operating room, Becca squeezed my hand tightly and promised Lily was safe. The bright surgical lights blurred above me as anesthesia spread warmth through my arm, and my final conscious thought before everything faded to black was painfully simple. My parents chose Taylor Swift, but my coworker chose me. When I woke up hours later in recovery, groggy and aching from surgery, Becca was still sitting beside my bed with a cold cup of coffee in her hands because she had stayed there the entire time. She told me the appendix had fully perforated and that another hour could have caused life-threatening complications. Then she reassured me that Andrea had reached my house safely. Lily had woken briefly, accepted the explanation that mommy had a work emergency, and gone back to sleep peacefully. Relief hit me so hard it physically hurt, but when I reached for my phone expecting at least some sign of concern from my family, there was nothing. No missed calls, no texts from my parents asking if I survived surgery, no message asking if Lily was okay. The only notification waiting for me was from my sister Karen, casually saying mom told her I had some stomach thing, and adding excited emojis about the concert Mackenzie could not wait to attend. I stared at the message in disbelief because somehow my emergency appendectomy had already been reduced to an inconvenience barely worth mentioning. I set the phone down and lay there listening to the quiet hum of hospital machines while the full weight of reality settled over me. The refusal hurt, but the silence afterward hurt even more. People can make selfish choices in stressful moments, but it was the complete lack of guilt, concern, or urgency afterward that finally forced me to see my family clearly. The next morning, I was discharged from the hospital. The surgeons strongly advised me not to drive myself home after emergency surgery and asked who was picking me up. I lied and said someone was on the way because admitting the truth felt humiliating. In reality, there was nobody coming. I drove myself home slowly, gripping the steering wheel while every bump in the road pulled painfully against my stitches. When I finally walked through the front door, Lily ran toward me and wrapped her arms carefully around my waist. I winced from the pain, but held her tightly anyway, because at least one person in my life was genuinely happy I made it home. She told me the overnight nurse had made pancakes and read bedtime stories to her before leaving a sweet handwritten note on the kitchen counter saying Lily was wonderful and to call anytime I needed help. A complete stranger had shown me more kindness in one night than my own parents had shown me in years. Later that afternoon, while resting on the couch with a pillow pressed against my stomach, I opened Instagram and saw my mother's stories from the concert. There she was smiling in sparkly clothes beside Mackenzie, proudly wearing matching friendship bracelets and captioning photos with phrases like living our best lives. I could even see the seat numbers visible in the background of one picture. Section 112, row F, the exact seats she valued more than being there for her daughter during emergency surgery. I took screenshots of every single post, not because I wanted revenge, but because part of me still struggled to believe this had actually happened. I needed proof. So I would stop trying to excuse it in my own mind. That night, while my mother danced beneath concert lights, I sat quietly on my couch recovering from surgery and opened a spreadsheet on my laptop. For the first time in my life, I started documenting everything I had done for my family over the last 2 years. Every appointment, every errand, every hour spent fixing problems nobody else wanted to handle. I listed the dozens of cardiology visits. I drove my mother to the endless VA paperwork for my father, the tax returns I completed for Karen, the grocery runs, phone calls, scheduling issues, emergencies, and favors. By the time I finished calculating everything, the number stunned even me. Over 400 hours of unpaid labor and more than $8,000 worth of professional level help given freely out of love and obligation. I stared at those totals for a long time in complete silence. 400 hours, $8,000 years of emotional labor, caretaking, and sacrifice. And when I needed one single night of support during a medical emergency, they chose a concert instead. In that moment, I finally understood the truth I had spent years avoiding. To my family, I was valuable only as long as I was useful. The moment I realized my mother had called my workplace to suggest I was mentally unstable, the entire situation stopped feeling like family drama and started feeling dangerous. Monday morning, I was still recovering from emergency surgery, moving slowly around the house with stitches pulling every time I stood up too quickly. The surgeon had ordered strict medical leave for at least 2 weeks, no lifting, no long drives, no overnight shifts, and absolutely no stress, if possible. Stress, I almost laughed at that part. My body still hurt every time I coughed, but the physical pain was nothing compared to the sick feeling settling in my chest after the phone call from my supervisor. Donna sounded uncomfortable the moment I answered. She explained carefully that my mother had contacted the pediatric ICU unit twice that morning asking questions about my mental state. The first time, she told the nurses she was deeply concerned because I had been isolating myself from the family and acting emotionally unstable. The second time was worse. She directly implied I might be abusing medication and asked whether staff had noticed strange behavior from me at work. For a few seconds, I could not even speak. I sat frozen on my couch, gripping my phone while heat rushed through my entire body. My mother had called the hospital where I cared for critically ill children and planted doubts about my mental stability and professional judgment in nursing. Accusations like that are not harmless gossip. They can destroy careers. One complaint about medication misuse or emotional instability can trigger investigations, documentation reviews, mandatory evaluations, and questions that follow you permanently. Donna told me she believed me completely after I explained the truth about the surgery and the night my parents refused to help with Lily, but she also warned me that if my mother contacted the hospital again, it would have to be formally documented. After we hung up, Becca texted me almost immediately confirming everything she had overheard. Parts of the calls herself. According to Becca, my mother actually told the front desk nurse my daughter has always been dramatic and worried. She's having some kind of breakdown. I read that message over and over while sitting alone in my quiet living room, and suddenly everything became horrifyingly clear. This was not about a concert anymore. This was about control. My mother was trying to protect herself by creating a story where I was unstable, irrational, emotional, and unreliable, so that if I ever confronted her publicly about what happened, nobody would fully believe me. She was already shaping the narrative before I had even said a word. The next day, things got even worse. I received a text from my Aunt June, my father's older sister, the one person in the family who usually avoided conflict at all costs. Her message simply said, "I'm sorry, honey, I thought you deserved to see this." Attached beneath it were screenshots from a private family group chat I had not even known existed. Karen, my mother, and several cousins had spent the last 2 days discussing me behind my back. Karen mocked me for overreacting about the concert incident and insisted that because I was a nurse, I should be used to emergencies and stop acting like a victim. My mother responded by saying I had always needed attention and that I was punishing everyone over one little misunderstanding. One cousin even asked whether I was mentally okay, and instead of defending me, Karen reassured them that I was just being dramatic. I sat there reading those messages with my stomach twisting harder than it had after surgery, but the final screenshot was the one that truly changed everything. Aunt June later admitted she almost did not send it because she knew once I saw it there would be no fixing the relationship. The message came from my mother late Sunday night after the concert. She wrote, "Honestly, if Fiona wants to play victim, let her. Lily can come live with us. When Fiona burns out, she's a single mom working night shifts. It's only a matter of time." I must have read those words 10 times in complete disbelief. My own mother was openly discussing the possibility of eventually taking custody of my daughter. Suddenly, all the comments about my mental health, the calls to my workplace, the dramatic accusations, and the concerned trolling made terrifying sense. She was building a narrative piece by piece, presenting herself as the worried grandmother, while quietly painting me as unstable and overwhelmed. As a pediatric ICU nurse, I had seen custody disputes Before I had watched grandparents gather screenshots, document incidents, contact schools, and slowly construct legal arguments claiming a parent was unfit, my mother might not have understood legal terminology, but instinctively, she was already creating documentation. Every message, every phone call, every casual comment was part of a future story where she would be the hero rescuing Lily from her struggling single mother. That realization chilled me more than anything else. Had I looked down at the hospital wristband still wrapped around my arm, I had not removed it, yet under emergency contact, the only name listed was Lily Yerger. My daughter was the only person in my family who loved me without conditions attached, and suddenly protecting her became more important than preserving anyone's feelings. The next morning, I called Rachel Dunn, a family attorney in Dayton specializing in custody disputes and harassment cases. Her office was inside an old converted Victorian building with dark wood floors and shelves packed with legal books. I brought every piece of evidence I had collected. Screenshots of the group chats, records of my mother's calls to the hospital, Instagram posts from the concert weekend, my timeline of events, and even the spreadsheet documenting over 400 hours of unpaid support I had provided my family during the previous 2 years. Rachel reviewed everything silently while taking occasional notes. Finally, she leaned back in her chair and told me bluntly that I was right to be concerned. She explained that while my mother had not formally threatened custody, her messages clearly showed intent to undermine my credibility as a parent, combined with contacting my workplace and implying mental instability. Rachel said there was enough to justify immediate legal action. She recommended sending a formal cease and desist letter ordering my mother to stop contacting my employer, stop making statements about my mental health or parenting abilities, and stop implying she had any future custodial claim over Lily. If the behavior continued, Rachel explained, we could escalate further with harassment claims, workplace interference, complaints, restraining orders, or preemptive custody protections. Listening to her describe everything in calm legal language felt surreal because it transformed what I had desperately wanted to dismiss as family dysfunction into something official and serious. I signed the paperwork that same day. On the drive home, I realized I was trembling. Not from fear anymore, but from grief. There is something devastating about sitting in a lawyer's office discussing legal protections against your own parents. When I got home, the house was silent except for the sound of Lily coloring in her bedroom. I opened my laptop at the kitchen table and created a document titled Incident Log, Yerger Family. Then I began documenting everything with clinical precision: date, time, event, exact wording, February 14th, 2:14 a.m. Called parents from ER requesting emergency childcare during life-threatening appendicitis. Request denied due to concert attendance, February 17th. Mother contacted workplace twice, implying emotional instability and possible medication abuse, February 18th. Received screenshots discussing future custody of minor child Lily Yerger. I typed for nearly 2 hours straight because I finally understood something important. Memories fade, but documentation survives. After that, I stopped answering calls entirely. I stopped returning texts. I stopped scheduling my mother's appointments, handling my father's VA paperwork, and helping Karen clean up her constant financial disasters. For the first time in my life, I disappeared from the role my family had assigned me. The reactions came quickly. At first, my mother acted confused, sending gentle texts, asking why I was being distant. Then came anger, 11 messages in one day accusing me of punishing the family and overreacting about one bad night. My father left voicemails saying my mother had cried for days and begging me to stop making things worse. Karen texted saying, "You're fine now, so can we please move on?" Not one of them apologized, not one admitted what they did was wrong. Every message focused only on how my silence affected them. That was when I finally saw the pattern clearly. My family did not miss me as a daughter. They missed access to me. They missed the labor, the emotional support, the convenience, the reliability. They missed the version of Fiona who solved problems quietly, without demanding anything in return. Meanwhile, Lily noticed everything. Even though I tried shielding her from it, one afternoon she asked whether we were seeing Grandma that weekend. I gently explained that Grandma and Mommy were taking a little break from each other for a while. Lily accepted the answer quietly, but over the following days I caught her watching me, sometimes with a thoughtful expression children get when they realize adults are hurting in ways they cannot fully understand. The silence in the house became overwhelming because for my entire adult life I had spoken to my mother almost daily, even during busy nursing shifts or exhausting weeks we maintained constant contact. Suddenly, that background noise was gone, replaced by a strange stillness that felt both painful and peaceful at the same time. Then on the 12th day, Rachel called to confirm the cease and desist letter had officially been delivered by certified mail, 2 pages, single-spaced, written in sharp legal language, demanding that Diane Yerger immediately stop contacting my workplace, stop discussing my mental health publicly or privately, and stop making comments suggesting I was an unfit mother. Rachel warned that if the harassment continued, we would escalate aggressively. I remember sitting at my kitchen table after hanging up the phone, staring out the window while rain slid slowly down the glass. For the first time in years, nobody needed anything from me. No rides, no paperwork, no emergencies, no emotional caretaking, just silence. And inside that silence, something unfamiliar slowly began to grow. Peace. The certified cease-and-desist letter changed the entire balance of power in my family overnight. For the first time in my life, I had done something none of them expected from me. I had stopped absorbing the damage. Quietly, Rachel mailed the letter on Wednesday afternoon through certified mail. Signature required 2 full pages written in cold, precise legal language, informing my mother that any further attempts to contact my workplace, question my mental stability, interfere with my relationship with Lily, or suggest custodial involvement would result in formal legal escalation, including harassment claims, restraining orders, and potential defamation action. There was nothing emotional about the letter. That was the point. It contained dates, documented incidents, witness statements, and direct references to her phone calls to the hospital. No yelling, no accusations, just facts. My mother signed for it herself the next morning at 10:12 a.m. Rachel later emailed me the scanned delivery confirmation with my mother's shaky signature across the green receipt card. I stared at that signature for a long time because I knew the exact moment she realized I was no longer playing the role she had assigned me. By Thursday evening, my phone looked like a disaster zone. 17 missed calls. Karen texted first in complete outrage, all capital letters, demanding to know what kind of daughter sends a legal notice to her own mother. I blocked her number without replying. Then Mom started calling from different phones after realizing I would not answer hers. First Dad's cell phone, then the house landline, then Karen's phone, then even Mackenzie's once, which somehow hurt the most because my niece should never have been dragged into adult manipulation like that. I blocked every single number one by one while sitting quietly at my kitchen table drinking reheated coffee. Dad never texted because Dad never handled emotions directly. That had always been Mom's territory. But Aunt June called later that night and told me she had found him sitting alone in the garage for almost 2 hours, staring at the wall without the television on or even the truck running. He doesn't know what to do, she said softly. I remember gripping the phone tighter before answering. He knew exactly what to do. 3 weeks ago, he told me to call a neighbor while I was being wheeled into emergency surgery, and June went silent after that because there was nothing she could say to make it less true. That was the strange thing about boundaries. When you have spent your entire life over-functioning for everyone around you, the moment you finally stop feels catastrophic to the people benefiting from your exhaustion. To me, I had simply stepped back to them. It felt like betrayal. Within 2 weeks of my silence, the entire family system started collapsing in ways they never anticipated because they had never realized how much invisible labor I had been carrying. Mom missed her cardiology appointment because she genuinely did not know where the office was located. I had driven her to every appointment for 2 straight years. There were 2 medical complexes in Dayton with almost identical names, and she sat in the wrong waiting room for 40 minutes before learning she was across town from the actual clinic. She missed the appointment completely and had to reschedule for another month later. Dad's VA disability paperwork became another disaster. He missed a filing deadline because he had no idea which forms needed to be submitted or how the online system worked. He spent hours bouncing between departments on the VA hotline before accidentally getting locked out of his account trying to reset the password. According to Aunt June, he eventually panicked and admitted, I don't know how Fiona kept track of all this. June later told me he sounded less angry than genuinely lost, like someone realizing for the first time how much work had quietly been done for him every single week without appreciation. Karen had her own reckoning when she finally hired a CPA after Years of expecting me to handle her taxes for free, the accountant charged $600 just to untangle 1 year's worth of disorganized paperwork. June actually laughed when she told me $600 she repeated for the exact work you did every year, while she acted like you were just helping a little. That number stayed in my mind because it represented something bigger than money. For years my labor had been treated as natural, expected, automatic. Nobody calculated the cost because they never expected to lose access to it. But once I stopped showing up, suddenly every favor had a price tag attached. Every ride, every form, every phone call, every hour of emotional support became visible only after it disappeared. Meanwhile, my mother was desperately trying to control the narrative publicly. According to Aunt June, she had started telling people at church that I was going through something difficult and that the family was giving me space. She never mentioned the emergency surgery. Never mentioned refusing to help with Lily, never mentioned calling my workplace, accusing me of instability. Instead, she carefully rewrote the story into one where I was having some kind of emotional crisis. That was what narcissistic people do. When the truth threatens them, they do not apologize. They edit reality until they can survive inside it. But the most revealing change came online. Every single Taylor Swift concert photo disappeared from her Instagram account within days of receiving the legal letter, the matching friendship bracelets, the arena selfies, the captions about living our best lives gone. In their place was a vague photo of a sunset over a field with no caption at all. Aunt June noticed immediately. She knows she told me quietly over the phone she won't admit it, but she knows I never responded because by then I understood something important. Guilt does not always create accountability. Sometimes it only creates better hiding places. Around that time, I made the decision that terrified me more than calling the lawyer ever had. I decided I was going to Sunday dinner every week. For nearly 20 years, my parents hosted family dinner after church, same dining room, same roast chicken or pot roast, same people sitting in the same seats talking about weather, football, church gossip, and whose children were doing well in school. The consistency had always comforted me growing up, but now I realized something else about those dinners. They were where the family narrative got written. If I stayed silent forever, my mother's version of events would become the official truth, repeated over casseroles and pie until nobody questioned it anymore. I could already hear it happening. Fiona had a breakdown. Fiona overreacted. Fiona cut the family off for no reason. Fiona became unstable after surgery. Quiet people understand something loud people often do not. When we finally speak, we usually come prepared. The week before Sunday dinner, I turned my kitchen table into a war room. I printed everything, the spreadsheet documenting over 400 hours of unpaid labor I had provided my family, the screenshots from the group chats where Karen mocked me and my mother discussed Lily, eventually living with them after I burned out the Instagram photos from the concert, including the visible section 112 row F seats my mother valued more than helping me during emergency surgery. I organized everything carefully into a plain brown manila folder like evidence for a court case, because in many ways that was exactly what it was. Not a legal case anymore, but a moral one. I did not rehearse a dramatic speech because dramatic speeches invite emotional chaos, and emotional chaos was where my family always regained control. Instead, I practiced facts, dates, times, direct quotes, calm delivery, clinical precision. I wanted to sound like the nurse in the room, not the wounded daughter. Saturday night, after Lily fell asleep, I sat alone at the kitchen table reviewing every page again beneath the soft yellow light over the stove. The house was completely silent, except for the occasional hum of the refrigerator. I remember touching the top page of the spreadsheet and thinking about all the years represented there. Every appointment, every sacrifice, every time I had convinced myself love meant carrying everyone else until my own body finally collapsed. I called Aunt June before bed and told her I would be there Sunday afternoon. She sounded nervous. Immediately, Fiona, everyone's coming tomorrow. Hank, Linda, your cousins, everybody. I told her that was exactly why I was coming. Silence filled the line for a few seconds before she finally whispered, just be careful. I answered honestly, telling the truth is the most careful thing I've ever done. That night, for the first time since my surgery, I slept all the way through the night without waking up anxious or replaying conversations in my head. Sunday morning arrived bright and unusually warm for March in Ohio. I dressed Lily in her favorite yellow dress covered in tiny white daisies while she chatted happily about cookies and whether grandma would still make mashed potatoes. Children have no understanding of emotional warfare until adults Forced them to learn it on the drive over. Lily asked whether the timeout between Grandma and me was over, yet I looked at her through the rearview mirror, her little backpack sitting beside her, her hair neatly braided, and felt my chest tighten, painfully. Well, see, I told her gently. The drive to my parents' house took exactly 14 minutes. Same roads I had driven thousands of times growing up, same white house with green shutters and rose bushes lining the walkway, but everything looked different now. Like I was seeing the place through adult eyes for the first time instead of childhood. Loyalty cars already filled the driveway and street when we arrived. Karen's silver SUV, Uncle Hank's red pickup, Aunt June's blue sedan, Linda's minivan parked across from the mailbox. Full house, exactly what I wanted. My hands shook slightly on the steering wheel before I got out of the car, but it was not fear. It felt more like the adrenaline rush before a critical emergency in the ICU, that sharp moment when every instinct becomes focused and calm because there is no room left for denial. Lily unbuckled herself and suddenly asked, "Mommy, are you mad at Grandma?" I turned around slowly and looked at her. "No, sweetheart," I said carefully. "I'm not mad. I'm just going to tell the truth." She thought about that for a second before asking the question that nearly broke me emotionally. "Is the truth going to make Grandma sad?" I swallowed hard before answering, "Maybe, but the truth is still the truth." Lily nodded quietly, like that explanation made complete sense, because somehow my 80-year-old daughter understood honesty better than half the adults waiting inside that house. We walked up the front steps together, and I rang the bell while gripping the strap of my bag containing the folder. Dad opened the door almost immediately. The color drained from his face the moment he saw me standing there, not surprise, dread. He had clearly been hoping I would stay silent forever. "Hi, Dad," I said calmly. He stepped aside without answering right away. Inside, the house looked exactly the same as always. Same couch, same ticking wall clock, same framed family photos carefully arranged on the mantel. Except now I noticed something I had ignored for years. There were dozens of photos featuring Karen and Mackenzie. Only two included Lily. Mom stood up from the couch the second I entered the living room. She wore her usual cream-colored Sunday cardigan, but her eyes were already red, like she had either been crying all morning or preparing herself to cry the moment I arrived. Around the dining room, conversations stopped one by one. As everyone realized I was there, Karen froze with a wine glass halfway to her mouth. Uncle Hank looked down awkwardly at the table. Linda from church suddenly became very interested in adjusting napkins and standing there in the middle of the room holding a brown manila folder filled with evidence of everything they had tried to rewrite. I realized something powerful for the very first time in my life. I was no longer afraid of disappointing them. Fiona stood at the head of the dining table, with the manila folder still open in front of her. The white lace tablecloth wrinkled beneath the scattered pages, like the entire room itself had finally cracked open. Her mother's crying echoed through the house, loud and trembling, but for the first time in Fiona's life, nobody rushed to comfort her. Nobody moved. The silence hanging over the room was heavier than shouting. Linda, the pastor's wife, who had spent 20 years defending peace at every church potluck and family gathering, stared directly at Diane with visible disbelief. "You called her workplace?" she asked again, slower this time, like maybe she had misheard the first time, because surely no mother would do something like that to her own daughter. Diane pressed both hands against her chest, dramatically, tears streaking through her mascara. "I was worried about her," she cried. "She stopped answering my calls. She cut us off completely. What was I supposed to think?" Fiona finally looked directly at her mother again, calm in the same terrifying way an ICU nurse stays calm while alarms scream around her. "You we're supposed to think I had surgery," she said quietly. "You were supposed to think your daughter almost died." The words landed so hard the room physically shifted. Uncle Hank leaned back in his chair. Aunt June lowered her eyes. Even Karen stopped moving for a second. Diane opened her mouth again, ready with another excuse, another emotional detour, another attempt to turn herself into the victim. But Fiona continued before she could. "You told my supervisor I might be abusing medication." Fiona said, "You implied I was mentally unstable. You planted doubt about me at my job in the pediatric ICU, where people trust me with children's lives. Do you understand what that could have done to my career?" Diane shook her head immediately. "I never said drugs," she insisted through tears. "I said I was concerned. There's a difference." "No," Fiona replied, "there really isn't." The clock on the wall ticked loudly in the silence that followed. Lily sat quietly beside Aunt June at the far end of the table, clutching half a cookie in both hands, watching the adults with wide eyes that understood more than any of them wanted to admit. Dad finally spoke. but his voice sounded smaller than Fiona had ever heard it. Fiona, he said carefully, your mother was upset we all were you disappeared. Fiona actually laughed once short and humorless. I disappeared. She repeated, I spent 2 years making this family function. 2 years. The second I stopped, everything collapsed in less than 14 days. She gestured toward the papers spread across the table. Mom missed her cardiology appointment because she didn't know where it was. Dad lost his VA deadline because nobody knew how to file the forms. Karen had to pay $600 to a CPA because she didn't know where her own tax documents were. Karen flushed bright red immediately. That's not fair. She snapped. You volunteered to do those things. Fiona nodded. Once exactly. I volunteered out of love, out of loyalty, out of family obligation, and the one time I needed help in return, you all treated me like I was inconvenient. Karen slammed her hand down on the table. Because you always act like a martyr, she shouted. Nobody asked you to keep score. Fiona slowly pulled another paper from the folder. Actually, she said evenly, I didn't keep score until I realized none of you ever planned to. She slid the spreadsheet across the table toward Karen. 400 hours, $8,000 in unpaid labor. That's what my reliability was worth. Karen stared at the numbers and looked away. Fiona could see it happening in real time now. The shift in the room, the collapse of the narrative her mother had been carefully building for weeks until this moment. Diane had controlled the story. Fiona was dramatic. Fiona was emotional. Fiona was overreacting, but facts of weight, and once spoken out loud in front of witnesses, they become harder to bury. Aunt June finally spoke softly from the end of the table. She came home because you needed her, she said, looking directly at Diane. And Frank, you know that, right? Diane wiped her eyes angrily. I never asked her to sacrifice her whole life. No, Fiona said quietly. You just expected it. Another silence fell over the room. This one felt different, less defensive, more honest. Dad rubbed both hands over his face, exhausted. He suddenly looked every one of his years. We made a mistake, he admitted quietly. Diane turned toward him immediately, shocked betrayal flashing across her face. Frank. No, he interrupted softly. We did. It was the first time Fiona could ever remember her father openly disagreeing with her mother in front of other people. Diane stared at him like she didn't recognize him. You're taking her side, she whispered. There are no sides here anymore, he answered tiredly. There's just what happened. Diane's expression hardened, then something cold replacing the tears. So that's it, she demanded, looking around the room. Everyone's against me now. Linda finally spoke again, her voice calm but firm. Diane, nobody is against you, but your daughter begged you for help while she was being wheeled into emergency surgery, and you chose a concert. Diane burst into fresh tears. Again, it wasn't about the concert. Yes, Fiona interrupted softly. It was her mother. Looked at her with fury now instead of sadness. You have no idea what it feels like to be replaced. Diane snapped suddenly, to watch your granddaughter choose someone else over you over and over again. Fiona stared at her for several seconds before answering. Actually, she said quietly, I do. The room went completely still. Fiona looked toward Lily, sitting quietly at the end of the table in her yellow dress with crumbs on her lap and her purple backpack still hanging off the chair, because Lily knows exactly what it feels like when her grandmother never shows up for her piano recitals. Fiona continued. She knows what it feels like when there are 47 photos of Mackenzie on your phone and only 3 of her. Diane froze. Karen looked down immediately. Aunt June closed her eyes briefly, like the truth physically hurt to hear. She stopped asking if you were coming after the second recital. Fiona said, do you know that she was 8 years old and she already learned not to expect you? Diane looked toward Lily, finally really looked at her, and for the first time all afternoon the performance disappeared completely. No crying, no dramatics, just guilt, real guilt. Lily looked back, uncertainly clutching the cookie tighter in her hands. Fiona zipped the folder closed slowly. I didn't come here for revenge, she said. I came here because I needed all of you to hear the truth at the same table where I spent years pretending everything was fine. Nobody argued with her this time. Nobody even tried. Fiona picked up her bag, walked around the table, and gently took Lily's hand. Mommy, Lily whispered softly. Yeah, baby, can we go home now? Fiona looked around the room one last time at her father staring silently at the table, Karen standing rigid in the kitchen doorway, Aunt June quietly crying into a napkin, and her mother sitting motionless beneath the ticking clock, like someone finally forced to face herself without distractions. Yeah, Fiona said softly, we can go home now. And for the first time in a very long time, home no longer meant her parents' house. Fiona sat alone in the kitchen long after the house had gone quiet, the only light coming from the stove clock glowing green against the dark walls. Lily was asleep down the hall, curled beneath her purple comforter with one arm wrapped around a stuffed rabbit she had owned since kindergarten. The silence in the house felt different now, not empty, not Lonely, just still peaceful in a way Fiona had almost forgotten life could be. Her phone rested face down beside a cold cup of tea, but every few minutes her eyes drifted toward it anyway, half expecting another message from family, another emotional explosion, another attempt to drag her back into the role she had finally stepped out of. None came. For the first time in years, nobody needed her to fix something before morning. No appointment reminders, no forms to submit, no crisis texts from Karen, no late-night calls from her mother asking her to explain insurance paperwork. She could have read herself. The world had not ended because Fiona stopped carrying everyone. It had simply shifted its weight back onto the people who were supposed to carry themselves all along. The Sunday dinner spread across the family faster than Fiona expected. By Tuesday morning, 3 church members had called Aunt June asking if Diane was okay. By Wednesday, Karen had apparently screamed at one of the cousins for taking Fiona's side. Aunt June updated Fiona carefully, never dramatically, never with gossip in her voice, only facts. People are talking because nobody's ever seen you stand up for yourself before. She explained gently over the phone. They don't know what to do with it. Fiona stood at the kitchen counter while she listened, rinsing Lily's lunch container from school, peanut butter sandwich crusts, apple slices, untouched. I'm not trying to turn anyone against Mom, Fiona said quietly. I know, June replied. That's why this hits so hard. You didn't yell, you didn't attack anyone, you just told the truth. That was the part nobody could defend themselves against. If Fiona had screamed, the family could have dismissed her as emotional. If she had insulted them, they could have called her cruel. But she had walked into that dining room with dates, screenshots, receipts, direct quotes, and a voice so calm it terrified them more than anger ever could. 3 days after the dinner, Fiona returned to work for the first time since the surgery. Dayton Children's Hospital smelled exactly the same as always, antiseptic and coffee and exhaustion. The automatic doors slid open and the familiar hum of monitors and overhead pages wrapped around her like muscle memory. Nurses waved when they saw her walking back onto the pediatric ICU floor. Look who survived, one respiratory therapist joked softly. Fiona smiled for what felt like the first genuine time in weeks. Becca nearly tackled her in a hug at the nurse's station. You look human again, she said barely. Fiona laughed. Donna, her supervisor, stepped out of her office holding a chart. Good to have you back, she said warmly, then quieter. And for the record, HR documented your mother's calls. Nothing further happened. Your reputation here is solid. Fiona nodded. Once that mattered more than Donna probably realized. Hospitals remembered things. Rumors could spread through a unit faster than infections. The fact that Donna had believed her without hesitation still sat heavily in Fiona's chest. Thank you, she said simply. Donna gave her a look over the top of the chart. You know, Fiona, you're allowed to have emergencies. To the words followed Fiona. All night at 3:12 in the morning, Fiona stood outside room 8 helping stabilize a 6-year-old with respiratory failure, while monitors screamed and residents rushed around her. Her hands moved automatically, adjusting tubing, checking oxygen levels, speaking calmly to terrified parents. She was good at this. Everyone knew it. Reliable, calm, under pressure. The nurse who always figured it out. But halfway through the shift, standing at the sink washing blood from her hands, Fiona suddenly realized something painful. She had spent years giving strangers more grace than she gave herself. If a patient's mother had called from an emergency room begging for help with her child, Fiona would have moved heaven itself to make sure that child wasn't left alone. Yet somehow she had accepted less care from her own family than she would expect from strangers in a waiting room. The realization sat heavy in her chest for the rest of the night. A week later, Lily had piano practice after school. Fiona almost missed the significance of it because she was distracted reading emails in the parking lot. But when she walked into the elementary school auditorium carrying Lily's music binder, she noticed her daughter scanning the audience nervously from the stage looking for someone. The sight nearly broke her heart. Fiona waved immediately. Lily spotted her, smiled, and relaxed. That was all it took. One person showing up, one familiar face in the audience. Fiona sat through every uneven note of the recital with tears threatening behind her eyes because suddenly she understood something her mother never had. Children do not measure love in grand gestures, they measure it in presence, and who sits in the folding chair, and who claps loudest, and who actually comes after the recital. Lily climbed into the car clutching a wrinkled sheet of music. Did I do okay? She asked. Fiona looked at her through the rearview mirror. You did amazing. Lily smiled proudly, then after a pause asked quietly, Grandma didn't come again? Fiona tightened her hands slightly on the Steering wheel no, sweetheart. Lily stared out the window for a moment. That's okay. She said eventually, you came. Fiona had to blink hard before she could safely pull out of the parking lot. Meanwhile, life inside her parents' house continued changing in uncomfortable ways. Without Fiona managing the invisible machinery of everyone's lives, cracks kept appearing. Dad missed another VA deadline because he mailed the wrong forms. Karen accidentally overdraft her business account after forgetting quarterly taxes. Diane had apparently started writing appointment dates on sticky notes all over the refrigerator because she no longer trusted herself to remember things without Fiona texting reminders. Aunt June told Fiona one evening, not unkindly, your mother is realizing how much of her life you are quietly holding together. Fiona stirred sugar into her coffee silently. That was never supposed to be my job. No, June agreed softly. It wasn't. One rainy Thursday evening in April, Fiona came home from yoga class to find a handwritten envelope tucked into the mailbox. No return address. She recognized her mother's handwriting immediately. She almost threw it away unopened. Instead, she sat at the kitchen table while Lily colored nearby and carefully unfolded the letter. Inside the letter was only one page, not dramatic, not manipulative, not filled with guilt, just painfully honest. Diane wrote that she had spent weeks replaying the phone call from the ER in her head, that she kept hearing Fiona's shaking voice saying Lily was home alone. She admitted she had convinced herself the situation wasn't that serious, because accepting the truth would mean admitting what kind of choice she had made. She wrote that seeing the screenshots laid out on the dining room table felt like watching someone read my worst thoughts out loud. She admitted the message about Lily had been cruel. She admitted she was jealous of Barb, jealous of Mackenzie, pulling away, jealous that Lily loved Fiona more than her. I spent so much time trying not to lose one granddaughter. The letter said that I damaged my relationship with another one. At the bottom, in shaky handwriting, Diane wrote something Fiona never expected to read. I am sorry I made you earn love that should have been freely given. Fiona stared at that sentence for a very long time. Lily looked up from her coloring book. Mommy, Fiona folded the letter carefully. Yeah, baby, why are you crying? Fiona touched her cheek, surprised to find tears there at all, because sometimes people tell the truth too late. She answered softly. She did not call her mother that night, but she did keep the letter. Weeks passed, then months. The relationship never returned to what it had been before, and honestly, Fiona no longer wanted it to. Some things once seen clearly cannot be unseen, but boundaries slowly became routine instead of war. And learned to ask before visiting. Dad learned how to use the VA portal himself, though he still called Aunt June whenever he forgot a password. Karen remained distant, brittle with resentment, but Fiona stopped chasing reconciliation. That only worked when she apologized first, and slowly, quietly, Fiona built a life that did not revolve around rescuing everyone else. She started sleeping more, started reading novels again, started saying no without explaining herself for 20 minutes. Afterward, one Saturday morning, nearly 6 months after the surgery, she and Lily went to the farmer's market downtown. Lily walked beside her carrying strawberries in a paper bag while sunlight spilled across the sidewalks. No emergencies, no tension, no one demanding anything from her, just an ordinary morning. Lily slipped her hand into Fiona's and looked up suddenly. Mom, yeah, you seem happier now. Fiona looked down at her daughter, really looked at her, and realized children notice everything, even the things adults try to hide. I think I am, Fiona admitted that night. After Lily fell asleep, Fiona opened the drawer beside her bed and took out the hospital wristband. One more time, her name, her birth date, emergency contact Lily Yerger. She ran her thumb over the faded print and remembered the moment she first saw it in recovery, the realization that the only person in her family who loved her without conditions had been an 80-year-old girl. She no longer felt sadness when she looked at the wristband, only clarity. The night her appendix ruptured had felt like everything falling apart, but sometimes things fall apart because they were being held together by one exhausted person who finally ran out of strength. And sometimes surviving means refusing to carry people who would leave you alone on a hospital bed while they protect concert tickets. Fiona finally understood something she wished she had learned years earlier. Being needed is not the same thing as being loved, and the people who truly love you will never ask you to prove your worth while you are begging for help.